It's the final round of the presidential battle in France, and the war of words between the top two contenders is intensifying by the day. As Macron tries to gather more support by softening his domestic policies, the far-right challenger has proposed to change France's foreign policy quite drastically. The presidential frontrunner Marine Le Pen has sent shockwaves through Europe and across the Atlantic with her latest comments on Russia and NATO. In a press conference held in Paris, the challenger has declared that France will leave the military command of NATO if she wins the presidency. She also went ahead to suggest a strategic reconciliation between NATO and Russia once the war ends.
France can be useful in the resolution of the world's great disorders, if and only if it is independent. This is one of the reasons that will make me leave the integrated command of NATO. As soon as the Russian-Ukrainian war is over and has been settled by a peace treaty, I will speak out in favor of implementing a strategic rapprochement between NATO and Russia, as was once envisaged.
And right after the statement at the Paris news conference, the protester interrupted Le Pen with snide questions about none other than Vladimir Putin. The protester even brandished a picture of her 2017 encounter with Putin, which was cut out in the shape of a heart. Now, she was dragged out of the conference room by the security guard, and this is what the protesters had to say.
We're denouncing the complacency towards Vladimir Putin against the war, the fact that she has always been his friend, that in 2017 she was going to align with Putin with regard to Ukraine.
She used the image of Vladimir Putin to have an international status, knowing that he is a war criminal ever since Grozny and Aleppo. And today she is downright lying to be elected. But the day after the election, we can be sure that she will start an alliance with Putin.
Now, for more updates on this, our correspondent Rosie Burchett is joining us live from Brussels. Hello to you, Rosie. Now, Le Pen has said that France will leave NATO if she wins the presidency. What do you make of these remarks? And what about her suggestion of a strategic reconciliation between NATO and Russia?
Well, this press conference seemed to be a bid for Le Pen to try and present herself as a credible candidate for leadership to the wider world. And of course, these are a couple of nail-biting days for officials here in Brussels as they ask themselves if they can rely on France as a partner moving forward, particularly at this most critical of times with the war in Ukraine raging on. Now, Marine Le Pen, that presidential candidate, does not want to entirely pull France out of NATO, but she wants to pull France's troops out of NATO's military command. She would, however, we understand, according to her statements, maintain respect for NATO's Article 5. That's that mutual defence pledge which says an attack on one is an attack on all. But this, even pulling France's troops out of that NATO military command, it's hard to overstate just how destabilising that would be for the defensive alliance. That is something that would not just be, a difference in policy. It would be a major split among those 30 NATO allies. So something they'll be watching very carefully to see who wins those votes in just a few week or so's time. Now, when it comes to those comments on Russia, that is something which before this war might not have been such an outlandish thing to say in the view of some of these NATO leaders. NATO and Russia did have diplomatic ties, albeit very strained. There was, just even in the month or so before this war, a NATO-Russia Council. That's where all 30 NATO allies sit down at the table with Russia. But since this war has broken out, since this invasion, any sort of rapprochement with Russia is simply off the table for NATO allies at this time. So they'll be watching those comments from Le Pen very carefully and wondering whether that might be the person they are sitting with at the table with at the next NATO summit.
Right, and Rosie, Moscow's Ukraine invasion has made the otherwise neutral Nordic nations nervous. How long before the nations like Sweden and Finland join the military alliance, and what implications will that have on the region?
Well, Finnish Prime Minister Sanna Marin has hinted that a decision on whether or not to join NATO or to apply to join NATO could be taken in her country within weeks and not months. So we could be looking at a very quick turnaround here from these Nordic countries, Sweden and Finland, that have been traditionally militarily non-aligned. Now, that is a split in terms of Nordic foreign and defence policy. For example, Norway, Iceland and Denmark are members of NATO, but it would be a major change to have Finland and Sweden join, that those 30 NATO allies would become 32. Now, Finnish lawmakers are debating this over the coming weeks and will be taking a decision. They will base that on whether or not they feel joining the NATO defensive alliance will improve their security. And they're basing that on a white paper presented by the government, which presents pros and cons for joining. Now, that particular white paper says that joining NATO could increase regional security, but it also presents some risks, and the risks namely being that Finland has an 800-mile plus long border with Russia, and there could be increased tensions along that border. So that is something that they'll be very much taking into consideration, as well as, of course, public opinion. The idea, the sense here is that if Finland were to apply to join the alliance, Sweden might well follow, and that leaders of the NATO countries, which would need to unanimously greenlight those applications, what I've been told at least is that there is no great blockage to that, and that those applications would be likely greenlit and accepted in a short period of time. We have a major NATO summit expected the very early July or at the end of June, and that's as soon as we could really be looking at a decision on this. So a very quick timetable of accessions, certainly compared to previous NATO accessions.
Right. Rosie, thank you very much for bringing us all the latest there.
WION, now available in your country. Download the app now. Get all the news on the move.